who knows, I don't want to hear the answer, but who knows the term "got any gum chum"? One, two, the couple of Brits that are in here, only the Brits will know. This is what the English children said to every GI they saw. "Got any gum chum?" And the answer was, "Have you got a sister, mister?" We'll get to the other saying, which I'm sure you probably do know, later on in the presentation. But let's just look at the United States and its progress towards the Second World War. After the horrors of World War I, the last thing the United States wanted to do was to get involved in another European war. In their context, to save a republic like France or an imperialist empire like Great Britain from whatever was going to happen. And much like every other country in the world except Germany, right the way through the 30s, they were a country that wanted to be isolated. And then Congress passed the Neutrality Act in 1935 in order to basically have a foreign policy that said we will have no foreign policy. We will look to ourselves. America first, a phrase which has come back again. So that was the Neutrality Act. And the Neutrality Act of 1935 made it a federal offense for a United States citizen to go and fight for another country. By the start of the Second World War and by the Battle of Britain that I talked about the other day in 1940, 10,000 United States citizens had come to Britain to fight. Most of them had come through Canada. They'd come to Britain to fight. So they had committed a federal offence and they were in big trouble. We were in desperate trouble, as you well know from my previous talk after the Battle of Britain, on our own against a massive enemy on the other side of the Channel. And the relationship between Roosevelt and Churchill was crucial. But of course, Roosevelt in 1940 was up for his third term of office, an election which was based on telling the people in his election speeches that your boys are not going to be sent to any foreign wars. And he was quite open about this. But in the background, he was lending $7 billion of Lend-Lease money to the United Kingdom, 500,000 rifles, and a load of ships that had left over from the First World War. And that was kept relatively quiet from the American public because of the America First movement, led in part by the great Charles Lindbergh, the famous aviator, but also by an Anglophobe who was sitting in the American embassy in London. Joseph Kennedy, JFK's father, didn't like the Brits very much because he was Irish. So he was sitting in London and all his reports going back to the president were negative. They can't hold out, they won't do anything, they will sue for peace with Hitler and so on, until Churchill came along, until the Battle of Britain. Huge amount of trade was being done with Germany at the outbreak of war in September 1939 by the United States. That carried on right away until the United States declared war on Germany. An awful lot of Germans lived in the United States. My father's father was German in Australia. The Germans emigrated like any other nation, so they were spread out all over the world. And a lot of them lived in the United States. And there was a lot of Irish Americans as well. All of them not for Hitler necessarily, but not for Britain either. So the appeasement that went on in Europe with Chamberlain and up until Churchill took command was, if you like, as mirrored in the United States until Pearl Harbor. And until Pearl Harbor, a huge amount of support came from Anglophiles in the US. Food parcels, mobile hospitals. The United States set up a series of merchant sailors missions on the east coast of America to look after sailors on the convoys to give them shelter and to give them food and pastoral care on the east coast, eastern seaboard of the United States. All that changed on the 7th of December 1941, and by that time there had been so many pilots. There were 11 United States citizens flying in the Battle of Britain. By the 1941 Pearl Harbor attack, there were 3 squadrons called the Eagle Squadrons of Americans only, wearing Royal Air Force uniform with Royal Air Force wings, and an awful lot of them with Royal Air Force medals. And in fact, when they went into the United States Army Air Force later in the war, they were inspected by Ira Eaker, the general of the United States Army Air Force, and he wanted to know what they were doing wearing these non-American medals. And one pilot famously said to him, "This was given to me by the King of England, and it's only he can take it off me." And they often used to wear both wings on their uniforms, their RAF wings and their US wings. But this gives you some idea of what we thought of them. We thought these pilots from America were noisy. They forgot military courtesy. They had horrible table manners and drinking habits. They were in the true sense civilians for whom military courtesy and discipline had no meaning. And we're going to find this right the way through this story about the American GI. Hugely efficient, very hard-working, but compared to the British Tommy, much more relaxed in their behaviour. But we're going to start by telling you where the material I'm showing you came from. In the UK, if you were a serviceman, it was against King's regulations for you to carry a personal camera. It would only be a still camera even if you disobeyed the regulations, because there were very few movie cameras in Great Britain at that time. There was no colour footage. Very, very few colour. There are 2 colour films of the Second World War taken by Brits. One is a Royal Air Force station commander who takes a fantastic film of heavy bombers going to war at an RAF station, and the other is a lady in London who took colour film of the Blitz. And thank heavens they did, because they're the only 2 colour images, colour movies that we've got from Britain. This wasn't the case with the United States, mainly because of this film. It was decided that William Wyler, the famous Hollywood director, would be conscripted into the US Air Force, made a major, and he would make a film. How many of you have seen the original Memphis Belle film? Just a few. How many of you have seen the remake by his daughter? Yeah, a little bit more. I tell you, the original is significantly better than the remake, and I'm going to show you a clip of it in a moment. But the most important thing for today is that when William Wyler came over to take the film, he had combat cameramen with him, but he also bought 300 16mm colour movie cameras, wind-up movie cameras, 300, and colour stock for them. And he distributed them to the ground crew and the air crew, and he said, whenever your life is not in danger, film what is going on around you. And then we will look at it all and we'll weave it into the film so that we can make a film for the people back in the United States and show them what life was like for an airman or a GI in England. And when he left, having made this film, he told them to keep the cameras and the colour film they have with them. So we're very fortunate we're going to see colour movies of GIs enjoying themselves apart from this film. And then we'll look at the stills in a moment. But this is a short clip from the original Memphis Belle. This film is public material. It's War Department material. It's in the public domain. You can download it whenever you like on YouTube or wherever. It's about 40 minutes. I often show it on the ships, but have a look at it.
And this is the crew of the Memphis Belle, 324th Squadron, 91st Heavy Bombardment Group. Just one plane and one crew in one squadron, in one group, of one wing, of one Air Force, out of 15 United States Army Air Forces. It takes all of a pilot's strength to keep a 30-ton fortress in tight formation. But the formation is the bomber's best defense against enemy fighters. The first half of the mission is over, the easy half. Now to get home. Fighters at 6 o'clock. This is what a gunner sees. A speck in the sky. That's a fighter. And then a blink. That means he's firing at you. 2,300 rounds a minute. In a running battle, one of the most important instruments is the interphone.
There's 4 of them. 1 o'clock high.
They're coming around. Watch.
He said they're in trouble out at 2 o'clock. Watching. Got an engine on fire.
There's 2 more diving through the 94th.
Around the 10. I got him. He's coming around here. He's at 10 o'clock. Watch him, Scotty. Fire at 10:30 coming around.
Come on, you guys, get out of that plane. Bail out.
Yeah, I see him.
There's a tail gunner coming out.
Watch out for fighters.
Just to tell you that the average number of people on a B-17, depending on the role it was in, was between 10 and 12 young men. In a British aircraft, it was between 7 and 8. We made our aircraft so that there were only 1 pilot in the airplanes, and the American aircraft had 2. We couldn't afford the crews. So when you see an airplane like that going down, that's how many young men are in it. The colour photographs that I'm going to show you again. These 2 guys, Cal Sloan and Red Sand, they were 2 ground crewmen, and they came over like everybody else, but their mum gave them a box brownie before they set off with colour stock. And what they did was they took pictures of their life, and you'll see them. But they never knew what they took. And in those days, wet film, 12 ASA was the speed of the film. Any of you who ever used to get interested in photography will know that's very slow film, and you've got to be quite careful and know what you're doing to take the photographs. Well, they just clicked away, and they had never saw their photographs because they sent them home to their mum. And in those days, the colour stock couldn't be taken to the drugstore and developed. It had to be sent back to the manufacturer. So there was quite a time lapse. And they didn't see these photographs until they came back. And as you see them, you'll realise how lucky we are that they either didn't know what they either knew what they were doing, or we are very lucky that they with the stuff that they took. As the GIs started to come over, the first thing they were issued with was, it looks very tidy here, but this is a book, Instructions for American Servicemen in Britain. In actual fact, it was 4 sheets of foolscap paper, but it's been condensed into a book which you can buy. It takes about half an hour to read. It's wonderful. It's recognised as being one of the best descriptions of the British people ever written, because it's all in homespun language. It's all in ordinary talk for an ordinary GI, so they can understand what they're coming to. But it has in the last page is actually how to work out our money, pounds, shillings and pennies in those days. But the page before last is the important do's and don'ts. And these are them. You can read them on the screen. I'm not going to go all through them. But it was intended that the GIs would have some idea of why Britain looked so bad. I mean, they came over, and obviously they were interested in our young women, our young girls. But they couldn't understand why they were so scruffy, why they smelt so badly, why the front of their legs were red, their shins were red. Well, shins were red because they got them burnt trying to keep warm in front of open fires. Because we had no central heating in the United Kingdom. We were not a motorized society. Most people lived very close to where they worked or used a bicycle. Very few people had a motor car, and if they did, it was on blocks in storage because there was no gas for it, no petrol for it. So they came to a country that would have appeared to them to be extremely backward. Unless, of course, they came from a rural part of the United States, which had suffered from the Depression and still hadn't recovered. So these are the do's and don'ts. The last one is the one that probably, don't criticise the beer, food or cigarettes. Remember, they've been at war since 1939. So the Brits had been on their own since 1939, and the GIs were told, just remember this. We'll talk about them eating our food and later, because they were often invited to come for a meal. And as any housewife would, if you have guests, you lay on the best spread of food that you can. And initially the GIs used to take one look at this and eat it all, not knowing that she had put on the table probably a whole month's ration of food. First impressions weren't good. On the trip across by sea, often in one of the huge liners, Queen Mary, they were converted to a troop ship. They went very fast on their own. They were not protected. They were not in convoys. They were not protected. They just relied on speed to get across. They'd bring thousands at a time, and 3 million GIs came to England, ladies and gentlemen, 3 million. Their first impressions were, because they came over in the winter, and they docked up in northern Scotland and travelled south. Their first impressions were it was cold, it was wet, it was muddy, it was dirty, the food was uneatable, and in fact, initially the American authorities believed that the GIs could subsist on the same rations that the Brits were subsisting on. That lasted for about 3 months, and then they had to ship the material in that the GIs would eat, and also the materials from home that they were used to, hot dogs, Coca-Cola, the thought, you know what I'm talking, hamburgers and that sort of thing, things the Brits had never seen before, and we've got them to this day on every street corner. The other thing they had to get used to was the bicycle, because the first people who came were the airmen. The first part of the war was dealt from the air. The guys that were going to go to Normandy, they didn't come until later on. The first ones that came were airmen. So they suddenly had to occupy 120 new airfields. Some of them occupied RAF airfields, but 120 new ones were built. And they were all in the countryside. Most of them were in East Anglia, which is just northeast of London, in the flatlands closest to occupied Europe. And each one of those bases, and they were very close together, near little hamlets, little villages, had 3,000 young men suddenly appear. And the infrastructure around it was negative. There was none. One pub, perhaps, and so on. So suddenly little communities were invaded by 3,000 very fit, very young men, from the age of 17 up to probably maximum 28, 29. The recruitment process in the United States was initially relatively rigorous. They had a height limit, a fitness limit, a literacy limit, and so on. By the 1944, that had gone. By 1944, anybody virtually could be conscripted into the United States military. Illiterate people, people with one eye, one arm, quite extraordinary. We did the same, I have to say. We'll talk later about the help that people who were illiterate got, but this is the impression they first got: mud and bicycles. Because air bases are large. And we had learnt very early in the war that you don't line your aeroplanes up. Because if you line them up, they get destroyed on the ground by the enemy. So the airfields were thousands of acres large, and the aircraft were dispersed all around the edges in little dispersals. And those dispersals were a long way from anywhere, so the only way to get to them was by bike. So the most prolific thing on the base is a bit like Amsterdam yesterday. You had twice as many bicycles as you did people on every air base, and everybody got around by bike. This is how they lived. Now, this is the great thing about these photographs. They wanted to show Mum where they were living. So this photograph on the left is a bed space. Now, a British airman or soldier or sailor would be very envious to see this amount of kit. They had their walking out uniform. The British didn't. They had their working overalls. They had their working kit. They had their daytime uniforms. So this is it's two men's bed spaces. And on the right, there's a lovely picture of the man just writing a letter home. And the first thing that we noticed about them was that they, as I said earlier, they were significantly more relaxed than we were. The average British soldier's uniform was a very hairy, very uncomfortable jacket done up to the top, no tie for an enlisted or a private soldier. An officer would have a tie, but no tie. Had the same uniform to fight in as he did to walk out in. He had boots that had hobnails on them. So when he walked, it made a racket. You've seen the pictures, or you've seen for real the guardsmen at Buckingham Palace. They're the only ones that have those boots nowadays, by the way, and that's for ceremonial purposes, to make a big noise. That's what our soldiers were equipped with. Everybody had to carry a gas mask, but they were dull. The American, on the other hand, they had this gold uniform, gold trousers and green khaki jacket, nice woven tie, pressed tidily, rubber-soled shoes, and also he moved differently by the nature of his uniform. Also, he was more relaxed about military discipline. So if, for example, you were pushing your bike up the lane or up a hill or whatever, and an American army vehicle came past, they would stop and put your bike on the back and say, "Can we take you, where do you want to go?" Our guys never did that. They obviously did, but not in the same relaxed manner. The whole thing about the civilian in the military, which I was talking about at the very beginning. So they worked hard, so they played hard. This is Bob Hope playing to the Americans. You heard Glenn Miller when you came in on the music that was running. Glenn Miller went all the way around where the Memphis Belle was based, at Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire. He did a number of concerts in the hangar there underneath the aircraft. So they had this, we had an entertainment system too, ENSA it was called, but they had, they would get all the big stars to come over. And a number of the big stars actually joined the United States Air Force. This is them at leisure. All their bases were in East Anglia, which is relatively close to London or Cambridge, big cities. So when they had their days off, they would get on a bus which would take them into the city. This is film taken with those cameras that were left after the Memphis Belle was made. So they're playing baseball with a cricket bat. Why wouldn't you? See the uniforms? They had to give a leaflet out to them, to the British soldiers, to tell them what ranks were in the United States services, because our guys were saluting their private soldiers. This is typical of their generosity, another thing I'll be mentioning quite a lot. They had the food and the ability to be generous, and they were always very generous. They also were a long way from their families and their siblings. So the opportunity to do something with youngsters, kids, they took with both hands. They loved playing with children. It's a Red Cross girl. The children love them.
Why are the stars always winking and blinking above? What makes a fella
See, that could be his sister.
It's not the season, the reason.
No health and safety in those days.
It's just Elmer's tune. What makes a lady of 80 go out on the loose?
And for a girl to find somebody of the opposite sex to dance with was quite an achievement, and you'll see quite a lot of girls dancing with each other. And of course, if you wanted to dance, dancing with a Brit in uniform was like rubbing yourself up against a piece of sandpaper, whereas the GI was really smooth. And their rubber shoes again. That's where the music would be coming from. There's the girls dancing together.
The cop on the beat, the candy maker, the baker, the man on the street, the city charmer.
That's his girlfriend. You'll see her again. This is Cambridge. So, you know, they played hard as well as worked hard. But it wasn't all a bed of roses, even if you were a ground crew and you didn't fly the missions. It was still hard work, and there were problems and difficulties. The weather particularly. This is a dispersal out on the edge of the airfield in the snow. They built that out of packing cases. They're just temporary buildings, but that's where they would warm themselves when they were working on the aircraft. See all the bicycles there. Ground crew on the line. It's clearly a nice day, but it's winter. They've got a brazier that they're burning. In the background, you've got a B-17 and a couple of P-38s. These are reconnaissance aircraft. They're long-range tanks. I talked about reconnaissance in one of my talks. Very brave men who flew very low to take photographs. And these two chaps on the right here, this is probably flak damage. Could be fighter damage, but more like flak damage. This is a P-51. It's a P-51D. You can tell that by the year of manufacture, because that letter there, the first number of the serial American aeroplanes, is the year of manufacture. Earlier on it would have had another 4 on, but by 44 they'd taken the first number off. But the rudder is made of fabric, so these guys have come out to the dispersal. They're not working in a hangar, and they are going to remove that rudder and replace it with another one. And that's the sort of work they did, but they would bring their own toolbox and work on it wherever they were. Overpaid, oversexed, and over here. Yeah? The answer was underpaid, undersexed, and under Eisenhower. So everything has an answer. This is a 1 minute, 10 second. They feel longer, these clips, but none of them are longer than 2 minutes, would you believe? 1 minute and 10 seconds, and I want you to look out particularly for the Piccadilly Commandos. So just a young couple having a day off together. You saw her in the previous film. He's got a cigar the size of Churchill's. You wouldn't find a British Tommy with anything more than a rolled up cigarette or a woodbine, as we called it, which was tiny and thin. Cigars in his right hand. Three buddies, well fed, well dressed. The bicycle, ubiquitous bicycle. There's the Piccadilly Commandos. Yeah? You know what they were, don't you? This was the biggest issue. Pay. Just look at the difference in how much an American GI was paid compared to a British, Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, South African, Rhodesian was paid, Polish. It was so much greater that you could not hire a taxi in London during the American occupation because they could pay significantly more. And they used to hire a taxi for a day. One chap wanted to buy one and take it home with him. It gets different as you get more senior, but you would expect that, wouldn't you? But the pay was so different that the average American enlisted man could go and use the best restaurants in London. And they did. And it caused quite a lot of resentment with the rest of the Allies. And if you remember, they were told not to point out differences when they came over. The one thing they were told not to raise, not to bring up, was the differences in pay. The work was relentless. This is the aeroplane of a guy called Don Gentili. It's a P-51B. It's got the top canopy, but you can see he's an ace because he's had all these kills. And this chap's got his head up inside, looks like he's working on the coolant system or the oil system, but it was relentless. They worked very, very hard, which is why they played so hard. But there were impacts and consequences. This is just the taxis and the Piccadilly Circus in those days. We're so lucky to have these photographs. But of course, the American military was segregated, black and white. And the first guys that came over were black because they were mainly pioneers. And they built the infrastructure that their comrades were going to join and come and use. So they came first. And also they had, in the main, come from rural areas that had been in depression, had not yet come out of it. So the state that the UK was in when they arrived was not much different than where they'd come from. And also they were subservient in the culture that they'd come. They were very, very polite. They called people sir and ma'am quite naturally. And the British were used to black people. We had immigration because we were a maritime nation, and didn't see any reason for segregation. Worse than that, the American military tried to get the British to operate the segregation that they introduced into their armed forces. And the British, to their credit, authorities refused. They sent a letter to every mayor, every chief constable, and they said, when you are requested to segregate, do not comply. If you are asked for one particular building or one particular pub or restaurant or one part of the city to be black and one part to be white, do not comply. This led to some quite serious consequences. Riots, armed shootouts in the strangest of places, in the middle of Cornwall. At Launceston, on the border of Devon and Cornwall, there was quite an extensive armed shootout between whites and blacks. And when you think that the segregation in the US military didn't end until 1947, these chaps fought in a war against a racist regime. And when they went home, they went straight back to the segregation they'd come from. One of them eloquently put it that we fought together, we died separately. This is one of them talking about life in the segregated military of the United States, and his girlfriend talking about what it was like to have a black GI as a boyfriend.
I took a British lady to a movie or to a restaurant. I'd have to fight my way out. I'd fight the Americans. The American white troops weren't used to integration, so they couldn't stand to see a black man take a white woman to a pub or whatever.
We started talking on the pavement, and I spotted 3 white Americans coming along the pavement towards us, and he looked very uncomfortable. Anyway, they came up to us, and the fair-haired one, he said to the coloured boy, he said, "Boy, what are you doing walking on the sidewalk? And what are you doing talking to a young white lady?"
As I said, 3 million American GIs came to the United States. One of the consequences that was between 1,200 and 1,700 illegitimate babies were born to black GIs, and about 22,000 illegitimate babies to white GIs. It was very difficult to marry your GI boyfriend. The services didn't want you to do it, they didn't like it, they would make it as difficult as possible. Also, quite understandably, I suppose, A lot of the GIs did not tell the girls they were going out with that they were married at home. What would happen is when they sought to get together and get married or get engaged, the officer, the GI would have to ask his officer for permission. And depending on the attitude of the officer, the guy would either be posted or sent away to another station immediately with no forwarding address for the girl, or permission, the investigation would take place and permission would be granted, but after quite a tortuous process. But as you'll hear, an awful lot of young couples went through the process and ended up living happily ever after. Leave was something they looked forward to, furlough as they called it at the time. And this is lovely because they've gone to Scotland and they've seen somebody in a kilt. So let's take a photograph. They also took memories. This is Cambridge on the right, and in actual fact, if you were there on a day like today, it'd be a bit colder perhaps, but any day with the sun out, it has not changed from 1943-44 when that photograph was taken. This could be any village in East Anglia. It would have yellow lines on the pavements now, and it would perhaps have a bit of fresh paint here and there, but apart from that, that won't have changed either. So they photographed their memories. They wrote letters home. They were helped to write letters if they couldn't write. A lot of people gave assistance to them. Just going back a second, just so you don't think that it was all one-sided on the black-white issue. This lady, who had a stately home in East Anglia, sent a letter to the station base commander. She thought she ought to do her civic duty by inviting the GIs to come for afternoon tea on Sunday. So she wrote a letter saying she would be delighted to see between 6 and 10 American servicemen for tea at 4 o'clock on Sunday. P.S. No Jews, please. On Sunday, 4 o'clock, her butler opened the door, and there's 8 black American soldiers. And he said, I think there's been some mistake. And they said, no, Colonel Cohen was quite adamant we should come. So it's got two sides to every story, let's not forget that. So their memories are recorded in their photographs, and also their daily life on the line. This is on the left, it's we call it a fire station, you call it a firehouse, at Steeple Morden, which was an RAF station which was allocated to the United States Army Air Force. On the right, you've got another P-51, P-38 Lightning twin-engined reconnaissance aircraft coming in to a place called Nuthampstead, which still exists, and there's a radio beacon on it which I used to navigate my aircraft over regularly. You can just still see the runways. Anybody who's interested in aviation archaeology, in other words 20th century archaeology, which there's not a lot of it about, Great Britain is a fantastic site to explore because the infrastructure is still there. And if you go to somewhere like Bassingbourn in Cambridgeshire or Nuthampstead and stand in the middle of what was a bomber field or a fighter field, I swear you can still feel and hear what went on. Some of the buildings still exist, and some of the graffiti that was written inside still exists. When I was directing the Royal Air Force Museum, we reclaimed a number of walls. We actually managed to get them out in their entirety in frames, and we exhibited them in the museum with their graffiti across them. And they often had a picture of the aeroplane a crew flew, the names of the crew underneath, and then somebody not in their crew had put RIP at the bottom. End of a mission. These photographs are priceless because they record the jubilation of getting back and surviving. They're P-51 pilots of the 56th Fighter Group. There's only one difference between God and a fighter pilot, and that is that God doesn't think he's a fighter pilot. So these guys have come back from probably as far away as Berlin, They'd been in the air for 8 hours. You can imagine what the first thing was they did when they got down. But the second thing was they had a cigarette, and then they told each other lies about what they'd been doing all morning. They embellished whatever they'd been doing, because they probably all claimed the same aircraft 3 or 4 times, but here they are. You can see they're happy to be home. And also, you mustn't forget that in every air force in the world, the aeroplane is owned by the ground crew. They lease it to the pilot for the missions. And indeed, he has to fill out a form and sign it and give it to him, say that he's taking the aeroplane away. That's the way the system works. So when the aeroplane is absent, the ground crew are really, really worried, on tenterhooks, waiting for their pilot or crew to come back. Of course they want them, they're friends. They rely on each other so much. They rely on him bringing the aircraft back for them to maintain. He relies on them to maintain the airplane so well that it brings him back. So it's a very, very close relationship. So they're waiting, and they want to know how well their guy's done. So they want to hear just as much as they want to tell each other. The ground crew want to hear what he's done. And also the damage on the aeroplane they want to know all about, so they can do what you saw earlier, make the repairs. On the right here, they're getting down to probably a bit of an intelligence brief. This is the winter of 1944. So there's snow on the ground, glorious bright blue sky, which is wonderful for fighter pilots, very bad for the targets. And they're all chatting away about the last mission they had. The people. The Red Cross girl would go around with donuts and coffee all the way around the perimeter to where they were working on the dispersed aircraft. She would take a jeep or a truck, and she would go around and give them their donuts and coffee. She would also write letters for those who couldn't write, but also the British families that the GIs got to know when they went for their teas and whatever. I told you about them eating the whole week's ration or whole month's ration. That was soon understood by the American authorities. So if a GI was invited to an English home for Sunday tea or whatever, he would be able to go to the commissary and he would be given a box. And the box would contain the rationed items that the British had to wait for. So butter, sugar, maybe a couple of eggs, maybe a box of powdered egg if they were really lucky, which is equivalent to a dozen eggs. He would be given a box to give as a gift. And then, if you like, he didn't feel so bad about eating what was usually as much as they could provide for him. He wouldn't feel so bad. And the authorities realized that system worked. And of course, it made the Brits even more inclined to invite a GI for tea, because they're going to come with presents. So the Red Cross and the British public and lots of women, as a result of the relationships the mothers built up with the GIs, they became surrogate mothers. So you have a lot of cases of the mother writing to the mother in the States saying how her boy was doing. So you'd get a relationship built up between the families, which still exists to this day. I'm sure there are people in this audience that can confirm that. So the Red Cross girl and the Red Cross clubs, they were set up in all the big cities, and they were open 24/7, and they provided for $2 a complete meal. They had people to write letters. They had everything that a GI would expect from home except alcohol. So hot dogs, hamburgers, Coca-Cola, 7-Up, whatever. This is the one at the Bull Hotel in Cambridge. This is a lovely picture, again, winter 44. They thought our beer was weak and warm. And of course, the laws in the United States vary from state to state, but the age for drinking was often significantly higher than the age of many of these young GIs. In the UK, it was 16 to go into a pub. I think in most states it was probably 18 or 21 even to have a drink. So a lot of them were introduced to their first alcohol in a British pub. And also, the beer was rationed. The drinks were rationed. Everything was rationed. And there's many cases of generous GIs walking into a pub and seeing 4 or 5 people playing dominoes or darts or whatever. They would say, what can I get you? And they could afford to buy a round. There's one lovely case of the first time this GI did it, there were 5 people. The second time, there were 25. So their generosity went before them. People knew that they were generous. So this is just a typical picture. Look how much is on the shelves. Virtually nothing, a few glasses. And the beer wasn't as weak as they thought it was. This is not Britain, but I just love the photograph. It's in Italy, actually, but they're all identified, they're all named. It's a crew of a B-24 Liberator, not the full crew, with a Red Cross lady, which is delightful. They also took pictures of their travels, again Piccadilly Circus with the statue of Eros, which is covered up so it doesn't get damaged by bombing. Looks a little different now, but not a lot. Everybody by law had to carry a gas mask, so these are their gas mask cases. And this is the guard house at Nuthampstead, and they're waiting for the bus to take them into Cambridge. And you can see how they're dressed. They've got brown shoes, gold pants, really well dressed, and the sort of, you've got to have a 50 mission hat. So even if you've only done one mission, you jump on your hat a few times, you bend it, you make it look like you've had a headset clasped to your ears for the last 50 years. You would do, wouldn't you, if you were only 20? This is one of the finest photographs of the whole sequence because this was taken dawn around Christmas 1944. And this is a typical shot which I have never witnessed because I'm not old enough, but it must have been quite something. These vapor trails that you see up in the high sky are the forming up of the bomber formations. B-17s, B-24s, Flying Fortresses and Liberators. They would spend an hour or more just getting into position, and they would have special aircraft that they could formate on, which were easily identifiable. They would be old aircraft that were way past their sell-by date. All they do is they go up first and they circle at 20, whatever the level was they were going to fly at, 20,000 feet, and they would circle, and everybody from that particular group would have their own identifiable aeroplane on which to get into formation on. Some of them were polka dot colored, some of them were bright pink, some of them were striped. They were all different, but they were very recognizable to the guys that knew them. They would formate, get into position, and there were seriously large numbers of mid-air collisions during this period because you literally had 1,000 aeroplanes climbing to different heights, trying to get into position, and then when the leader was ready, setting off to a stopwatch to Germany or wherever, in a particular way so that they were best defended against German fighter attacks. And they would set off a couple of hours before these chaps on the ground. So here we have the crews on the ground waiting to take off to catch up the bombers somewhere over occupied Europe and escort them, to protect them on their journey, perhaps as far as Berlin, perhaps even a little bit further. So these men are sitting watching their bomber comrades get their formations together before going over to Europe, and they're waiting for their takeoff time, which would also be to a stopwatch, where they would climb at twice the speed of the bombers and set off, and they would leapfrog each other so that they maintained, once the P-51D, which is what this aircraft is, came into service with its drop tanks, it could go all the way to Berlin and back. So they could escort. Up until then, it was significantly different. The Army GIs came over about 18 months, 2 years before D-Day to continue their training. And a large number of them were lost just in the training. When we were in Falmouth, just down the coast from Falmouth is a little piece of beach that was used for GIs to practice jumping off landing craft, scaling cliffs and all that sort of thing. Nearly 500 were lost on one particular day when German E-boats came in and attacked them. Training was even for the Air Force as well. Large numbers of casualties in training, never mind fighting against the enemy. And if you went to the D-Day cemetery above Omaha Beach, you will have noticed that the graves in that cemetery are not just from the 6th of June onwards. They go way back earlier with all the aircrew that were lost and are buried there from the bombing campaign, the combined bombing offensive of the months before. So the GIs started to move towards the south coast, the army GIs, rather than East Anglia, where the Air Force was. They moved into the south coast. And camps sprung up, much like the airfields, for training purposes, all the way along the south coast. This meant that relationships started to build on the south of England as well, between the local population and the GIs. And then on around about the 1st of June, maybe a little bit earlier, the local people woke up and they'd all gone. This is the best kept secret ever in military history, I think. As you know, D-Day, Germans didn't know it was going to happen. They knew it was going to happen, but they didn't know when or where. And this is what they did. They just went. They just suddenly left overnight. And there were particularly young women going up to the fence, to what was the guardhouse, and saying, "Where's Jim? Where's Joe? Where's Fred? Where's Harry?" Oh, they're gone. They're gone. And the thing that hurt the Brits most was you have a law in the United States, a federal law, the War Properties Act. And that states that if you are in a country, in a war zone, that when you leave nothing behind. You leave nothing behind because what you leave behind could destroy the economy of that country. It could stop the manufacture or the sale of goods that you've left behind because they're freely available. And you can understand why that law was brought in. But in the case of Great Britain in 1944, when they left, they bulldozed the beds, the pots and pans, the bicycles. They just dug big holes and bulldozed them in. And Great Britain was in such a parlous state with the lack of virtually everything that the people lost their friends, their fiancés, their boyfriends, people that they had grown very, very attached to, and also a lot of stuff that they could have used. But there's a lasting legacy to all this. 70,000 British women left the UK to become war brides. Operation Diaper was those that had children, and the Pilgrim Mothers was what they were called. The Red Cross advised them to be alert, adjustable, and ready for change. And the English Brides Clubs existed. And they, of course, after the end of the war, May 1945, this is a Liberty ship taking troops back home. And this is the Daily Express, one of the cartoons showing a war bride and child getting home. And what I like is he's got a cigar, baby's got a cigar, he's got a gun, granny's got a pipe, older granddad's got a pipe, everybody's got a pipe, there's the chickens eating, even the little baby here, see. So here she's rather startled because it says, "Welcome home, Wally and his bride." He told her he came from New York City. And it's a very famous cartoonist called Giles, and the caption is, "But honey, where did you get the idea that all Americans lived in skyscrapers?" The impact on the British culture was significant, and we have it still to this day. We're two great nations separated by a common language. That's about all. The music, the lightness of touch of the Americans fed into our culture. The young people, the teenagers that were yet to serve, had seen how they behaved versus how their elder brothers, if you like, behaved, and wanted to be more like them. We became more relaxed. The films, of course, Hollywood made a difference. We learned about different types of food, new food. Our attitude to authority became more relaxed as well. We didn't just take it for granted that if it was an officer, we would, respect him if we didn't, and so on. We would give a lift to somebody if we were in a military vehicle. The family connections exist to this day. And they've been handed down. So even though the originators are probably past now, their families still are in contact. Children and war brides are obvious, and they bring, I believe, our nations closer together. But let's not forget the sacrifice. On D-Day alone, 4,900 young Americans lost their lives. And in the 8th and 9th United States Army Air Forces, in the combined bombing offensive of occupied Europe, Second World War, the 8th and 9th Air Forces lost 76,000 men between the ages of 17 and 25. So we must never, ladies and gentlemen, forget the debt we owe to both everybody in the Second World War. Thank you very much.